Next lady I would like to tell you about, going roughly in chronological order, is a woman called Mary Kingsley. Now, Mary Kingsley was born in 1862 in London. And what happened with Mary is that she wasn't from such a wealthy family, possibly as Isabella Bird, but her father was a famous scientist and a famous writer. So she had the benefit of his library. And for the early part of her life, she was basically occupied with looking after her elderly parents who were ailing and being a kind of nurse to them. When they died, she found herself having inherited some money from them, and she decided that what she was going to do was to visit Africa. And the reason that she wanted to visit Africa was that she had read a lot about it in her father's library. But her father had actually visited in his scientific work as a naturalist. He'd visited every continent on Earth apart from Africa, and she felt that she would complete his studies, as it were. So, being very independent-minded, this seems to be a common quality with all these women. She bought herself some supplies. She bought herself a basic medical kit and got herself a passage on a ship to Africa on her own. Now, this was at a time when anybody going to Africa, this in the late 1800s, was really taking their life in their hands because of all the diseases, for a start, that were prevalent there. And, just the fact that it was a dangerous country to go to. And all her friends told her that she wouldn't come back, that she was just going to be buying a single ticket, that she was mad. And she took no notice of them whatsoever. And she had a very clear purpose in mind. What she wanted to do was to go and stay with some of the remote tribes that lived around the west coast of equatorial Africa. She wanted to study their religious practices. She wanted to study their culture. And she also wanted to make a study of the fish that lived in the rivers, so the freshwater fish that lived in the rivers that flowed down into the sea. So she was quite ambitious, I've got to say. And she, in sort of typical Mary Kingsley fashion, she just basically made it up as she went along. She landed in Africa. She obviously had a few contacts there, and there were some people in the ports that could put her in touch with a guide who would take her into the interior. And wearing the typical Victorian garments of a crinoline, very stiff corset, she didn't make any compromises at all in terms of her appearance. She basically took herself off into the rainforests of Africa and came across these tribes who were just carrying on in their own way as they had done for hundreds of years. Some of them were cannibalistic, and they had been carrying on these rituals, as they had done for centuries with their culture. And a lot of them wouldn't have seen a white woman before. So she was taking a huge risk on so many levels. And yet she was courageous. She could always find a way around communicating with people. She obviously had interpreters that she'd taken with her from the coast who were willing to go with her and guide her, at least for the time being. And she stayed with these tribes who actually welcomed her. They were quite curious as to her own purposes. And I think possibly, and you see this quite often with women, that because she was a woman, she wasn't a threat. And so therefore they were more curious than defensive. And so they welcomed her as a woman, and they shared information with her about their culture and about their practices and about their beliefs. And Mary found herself eventually being kind of deferred to, as almost if there was a difference of opinion between people within this tribe of this tribe that she was staying with. They would come to her as a kind of almost a judge to say, well, you have an objective opinion. What do you think we should do about it? And so they were kind of respecting her. They accepted her into their society. And she learned to canoe herself up and down the rivers while there were hippos bathing and swimming. And she was taking her life in her hands in so many different ways. And so when she came back to Britain, she found herself in great demand because, of course, she'd done the most amazing thing. She'd come back with not just natural history specimens, new species of fish for the Natural History Museum, but she'd come back with experience of these tribes people that nobody had actually studied before. So it was a very valuable study. And in fact, she was taking an interest in their culture in a way that was quite uncommon at her time. This was a time when the scramble for Africa was happening. That's what they called it. Basically, a lot of the Western countries were invading, as it were, and carving up Africa for their own purposes in terms of exploitation. They weren't really fussing too much about the impact on social people, the social lives and the culture and the existence of the people who were already there. But Mary was actually seeing them as people, and she was recording it at a time when, they were under threat. Their lifestyle was fast disappearing. And when she came back home, as well as writing books about it, she actually stuck her neck out and said, well, I don't think we should be interfering with these people. I think they have a right to live their lives as they wish, even though we might not agree with it or understand it. They have a right to carry on as they always have carried on. And of course, she was ridiculed for saying that. But she stuck to her guns. She wanted to make a point. And like Isabella Bird, she knew that she had a very fine line to tread when she came back home. And she actually did ruffle quite a lot of feathers for saying what she did. When she came to give a lecture to RSGS, and actually when she came to RSGS in 1896, I think I'm right in saying, it was the first ever public lecture she'd ever given. And she was feeling, because I think perhaps she'd come back and she was finding herself in the middle of an academic society, she felt a little too nervous to actually deliver her talk herself. So she got somebody else to read her paper for her. And that's in such contrast, that it really strikes me as being in such contrast to what she'd done out in Africa. She'd been this pioneering woman. She'd blazed a trail through the rainforest. She'd lived with people who, she didn't have a word in common with them to begin with, and yet she'd actually managed to communicate with them, get some real valuable information about their story, about their lives. And she'd made some good friends there. It was almost as if that was her environment, that was her natural environment. And then coming back to Britain, she was closing up again. It was very interesting. So that was another key character, Mary Kingsley, in the story of RSGS. And sadly, she didn't live to a great age because she went back to Africa, I think, a third time and died out there. So yes, I really do admire Mary Kingsley, and I admire her writings. They were fantastic. Her books are so entertaining.